we've got a bunch of amazing speakers for you, and we're going to start with Stefanie Molin, who's here all the way from New York. Thank you. Where she tackles tough problems in information security, particularly those revolving around data wrangling, visualization, building tools, and gathering data, and knowledge sharing. And she's going to tell you all about the cool books she's written and the work she's done developing NumPy doc. And she's got a bachelor's degree of science in operations research from Columbia University's Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. That is a lot of words.
It's a very long. We called it C's.
C's.
C's. Like
cool.
It's the 7 C's.
Yeah.
Got to shorten it somehow.
Yes. And she enjoys traveling the world and inventing new recipes and learning new languages spoken among both people and computers. So I'm going to let Stefanie get started.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Getting Started with Open Source Contributions. Again, my name is Stefanie Molin, a software engineer at Bloomberg in New York City. And I'm a core developer of the NumPy doc package, which I'll tell the story about how that came to be in this talk. And I'm also the author of Hands-on Data Analysis with Pandas. So I want to start by dispelling some myths around open source contributions. So the first is that only professional developers or maintainers can contribute to open source projects. And just like you don't have to be a professional developer or maintainer to use those projects, you don't have to be one to contribute. There are ways to contribute regardless of your experience level. And many projects accept help in a variety of forms. And the second myth is that only experts can contribute something meaningful. So again, there's a way to contribute in a variety of ways, and this can vary depending on your level. And there are actually certain cases where not being an expert in a tool is actually a preferred way for you to get some contributions in. You think about newcomer documentation, right? Who's going to be in the best position to write something that will understand where all the newcomers trip up than someone who is just a newcomer themselves? It is very hard for experts to put themselves in the shoes of a newcomer. Okay, so now that we've had those myths dispelled, we're going to talk about how you find a project to work on. And this is by far the hardest part of actually contributing to open source. You have essentially an infinite number of projects out there, an infinite number of things you could potentially be looking at. How do you find the one or the few that make sense for you to get started? And again, there are a variety of ways to contribute. It doesn't have to be adding some fancy new feature to a tool. It can be something like improving the documentation, translating documentation, adding better examples, making tutorials, building a community around a project, reporting bugs. There are a variety of ways. So the first thing I like to do is sit down and brainstorm potential projects. And at this point, I just write down what are projects I've used recently. No extra criteria, just that. Have I used this recently? Write it down. Later on, you will look through the list and evaluate for suitability. So the first level, just whatever comes to mind, you write it down. And then, once you have that list, you can evaluate those projects for suitability. I like to do this with 5 criteria. The first thing is I look at the software license that it's distributed with. And this, for a variety of reasons, one might be that your employer has restrictions on what types of projects you can contribute to based on that license. So that's a very easy way to weed things out. The next is to look at recent activity. So if a project hasn't had any releases or nobody commenting on it, talking about it, or et cetera, then maybe it's been replaced with something else, or it's not being used, or people have moved away from it. You want to avoid those projects. You want ones that are still active, right? If it's active, people will be using it, also contributing to it, and someone will probably come and review what you work on as well. The next is the code base size. So a smaller code base project, it will be a lot easier for you to get a foothold, right? There's less code that you need to review how it works to understand what you can contribute to or how to even add from a developer standpoint to that project. And then on the flip side, something that has a much larger code base will then be a lot harder to find your foothold. There's a lot more code that you have to go through and understand. However, I like to think of the code base in combination with the tech stack. So For an example, like if something has a really big code base, and maybe you're not familiar with that particular tool, but you know that that tool is built on top of something else that you are very familiar with, you're now in a very good position to contribute to that. So one example of something like that would be Seaborn, the data visualization library. Maybe you've never really looked at how Seaborn works, but you're really, really familiar with matplotlib. You are now in a fantastic position to contribute to Seaborn just from understanding that, because it's built right on top of matplotlib. And the final thing is repository access. So you need to be able to find the public repository for the code. It does not have to be on GitHub, but if it's not public, obviously you can't contribute it. Okay, so now that we have those brainstorm projects and hopefully we've filtered down, you have some projects that you can look further into. I'm going to walk you through 5 strategies that I've used to get started contributing to various Python open source projects. And the first one is to participate in sprints. And you're all very lucky that at this event there are sprints, so Monday and Tuesday, and there is availability from what I hear. I will be on Monday with my project Datamore, so be sure to check it out. But I did my first sprint at EuroPython in July of 2022. And I have to use my mouse because my clicker died, so hopefully, nope, you can't see. That's great. So I am in the back left, where the arrow is pointing. So that was me. And directly across from me were 2 of the scikit-learn maintainers. And what they had us working on, most of us had never contributed to scikit-learn before. So they had us working on their documentation and making sure that all their doc strings were compliant with the NumPy doc standard. And yeah, okay, it's not going to work. So making sure that we're compliant with NumPy doc standard. So each one of us would take one particular class or one particular function, update the doc string, make a PR. And I had gotten a few of them, so it was already merged. And then I started to have a problem. It was telling me, their script that they had to test that the changes were working, it was telling me that the doc string was not ending in a period. And I looked at it, and it very much looked like it ended in a period. I called over one of the maintainers. We stared at it for a bit, couldn't figure out what it was. So I decided to delete the whole thing and start over. And it turned out it was a trailing white space at the end of the period. So something that was not visible looking at from our end as humans. So I asked the maintainer, how do I not have this happen in the future? And the suggestion was to just install pre-commit. Now that was another thing that I hadn't heard of at that point. And at this point I did have to leave, so when I went home and I researched about pre-commit, got that set up for my personal projects, for work, and then also ended up making several contributions to other open source libraries, adding pre-commit setups for them. So you'll see that a lot if you contribute to a larger project, you're going to be exposed to tooling and things that they use, and smaller projects could really benefit from that, but maybe they don't have it set up, and there's a big opportunity for you to transfer that knowledge. So overall, I think my first sprint was definitely a fantastic experience. I will say that sprints do vary depending on where you go and which projects, and it is a bit of finding a good affinity for yourself. But I have participated in sprints both as contributor several times and more recently this year as a maintainer. And it is a great experience from either side. You will always learn something. So some tips to make the most out of your sprint experience. The first thing is to pick a project that interests you. You are limited in which projects are actually there. You can start your own, even if you're not a maintainer, and you can just gather a group of people that are passionate about some project and want to contribute to it. But finding something that interests you will help you be motivated to stick with it throughout the sprint, but then also afterwards to continue contributing to it. The next tip would also be to look for beginner-friendly projects. Now, beginner-friendly is subjective. So if a project says they're beginner-friendly, it might mean that they can support people new to the project, beginners to the project, or beginners to coding entirely. Now, everyone's very friendly at these events. You can ask if you're entirely new to coding, you're just starting out with Git, or you've never used GitHub before. You can just ask, see which projects are able to support that kind of contribution. And if you do need help at any point, you be sure to ask the maintainers for any support that you need. So most of the time, maintainers will come to these events with a goal in mind. So in the case of scikit-learn, they wanted to get their doc strings up to par with NumPy doc. So they're vested in getting that done, and they want to help people help them get that done, right? So both sides are very willing to help each other. And it's important that you go into this experience with an open mind. It doesn't matter how much experience you have going in, you will definitely learn something, right? You can use this opportunity to ask the developers how they navigate a massive code base, what kind of tools they use, what's their IDE of choice, what extensions do they have. You're just exposed to more things that you might not bump into on a day-to-day basis. And on the flip side, you might be using something that you think is really cool that other people haven't seen, and you can share that as well. So the second strategy is to contribute examples to the documentation. So I'm sure everyone in this room has at some point looked at a project's documentation and not quite understood how to use it. And it may have been that there were no examples, but it could also have been that the examples just weren't super helpful from you. Maybe some super expert on the topic wrote the examples, doesn't see how a newcomer might get tripped up on it, right? And then you as a newcomer didn't understand. So in my case, I was using the polynomial degree function from NumPy, and there were no examples at the time. And I was trying to figure out a couple things. What happened when there were trailing zero coefficients in the polynomial? What would the degree result in? And then what order I even needed to put the coefficients in. I didn't major in math. I don't know if there's a standard, but there wasn't anything explicitly saying that around the function that I needed. So I had to go open up Python, try out a bunch of things just to figure out what actually was happening, right? And so I didn't stop there, because surely someone else at some point, potentially in the past or in the future, would probably have similar, if not the same, questions that I did. So I packaged up the examples and put them in the documentation, and I sent a PR to NumPy, and they were very grateful to receive that. So there is a documentation paradox, right? Every project needs good documentation, but it's very time-intensive to write it, which then means that maintainers might need to deprioritize writing the documentation in order to keep moving the project forward. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because then, as people coming from the outside, you now have a very good in to participate in that project. And one thing I like to do is you can take a big project, something like NumPy, and you can poke around in parts of the library that maybe you haven't used before. Maybe there won't be examples there either, so then you can figure out how it works by creating those examples, and then add those examples to the documentation. So now you've learned more about how that library works, and then you've also made a contribution, right? So then the next person that comes along can just learn from your example. The third strategy is to browse open issues for ideas, and here's where I really need that laser pointer, so bear with me. So here is a screenshot from the GitHub Issues tab in scikit-learn. Now, if you look up to the top where it says Issues, in this screenshot at this moment in time, there were about 1,600 issues for scikit-learn. Now, I said browse open issues. I definitely don't mean read 1,600 issues. No one's going to do that. So you need to understand how to filter things down to something that is manageable. So in the screenshot, what I'm doing here is I've selected just the ones that are labeled good first issue. Now, you have to be careful with that, because that label is something that is available when you create a new GitHub repository, but there's no requirement for the project to keep it, or even keep it with that exact same name. So if that's not there, then you can click, and I would also recommend doing this in general. So just to the right of the search bar, there's a labels button. And in this case, there are 100 labels. So 100 is much less than 1,600, right? So you can do a quick scan through those 100 labels, which are how they're classifying their issues. And a lot of times there will be a description. So you can kind of get a flavor for it by scrolling down. You might see that, oh, there's a lot of these labels that are just mapping to a module in the library. So I'm not going to worry about looking at those. But then I maybe see some that are saying beginner or meta issue, or you can see the module one on the bottom, or documentation, right? So you can figure out what makes sense, what's in your wheelhouse, and what you want to focus on, and then use that to filter down the issues. Once you have those filtered down, the last thing I like to do is, before clicking into anything, if you look all the way to the right, there's comment counts. So in general, I like to look for things that have little to no comments, And this is because if something has more comments, it might mean that it's not clear what is actually to be done. There might be disagreements, people going back and forth, or someone may have claimed it, right? And you don't want to be wasting your time on those. Now, the one caveat to that is the middle issue here. If you look, it has 227 comments, and that is actually a very good one to take. And the reason here is that scikit-learn has these meta issue, which is the second label on there. And this, again, labels are defined by the repository, but something similar in this similar vein would be something to look for when you scan those labels. So this meta issue is scikit-learn wants to apply a change across a massive part of their API, potentially the whole thing. So think of the NumPy doc example, right? So they want to apply that over the whole thing. They don't want to put one massive PR touching everything. So instead what they do is they break it down. They might have a giant checklist or something saying, here are all the spots we want to apply this change. And then it's divide and conquer, which means you find something like this. You probably have several example PRs you can consult that have already been reviewed, merged, doing the exact changes, slightly different, of what you need to do. So this is a fantastic thing to look for. So tips on being successful with this strategy. So you can look for labels like beginner, easy, good first issue. Again, keeping in mind that everyone will have different ones. And also, grain of salt with beginner and easy, right? That's entirely subjective and depending on the developer who puts that tag. It might mean beginner to the project. It might mean, beginner or easy as in hard might mean something like it's hard for the developer, but maybe not for everybody to do. I've had success with a library called Yellowbrick, which does visualizations for scikit-learn models, and they had an issue. We'd really love to have a pre-commit set up, and they tagged it hard. And that's because everyone that was a core developer at that time did not know how to do it, so it was hard. So grain of salt on the beginner and easy ones. And then it's also important that you don't disregard old issues. So just like with a search engine, people might not go to the second page of results, the third, the fourth. And the case I just mentioned with that pre-commit one, I think that issue was 4 years old when I took it, and then they were super, super thankful that it was done, because it was hard for them, right? In the case of Seaborn, I've also had success going to the end of the backlog. I found an issue that was 9 months old, no comments, but it was created by the creator of Seaborn. And when I read it, I was like, this is just matplotlib, a for loop in matplotlib. And the important thing here is that you just ask, hey, are you still interested in this? I would like to work on it. You get a yes, and then you're good to go. And so that actually led to the reference line functionality for grid plots, facet grid and joint plot, if anyone has used that. And again, those meta issues, if you see some tag or some label related to that, definitely go and check those out. Those are great ways to get started. And if anything that you find that it does interest you, always make sure that you comment on that issue. That doesn't mean that someone else won't just beat you to it. It's still possible. But at least you've announced your intention, and people who respect the etiquette of that won't go and try to do that. And that's also a good spot for you to ask if you need help. You can also volunteer that you want to work on something, even if you're not sure how to do it. And I have more tips in the article I've linked here. The slides are on my website for more tips on how to navigate the issue tracker. So the fourth strategy is to identify and fix a bug. So this is now going to require a heavier use of the project. It's still possible that you're reading the docs and you find a typo or an omission, right? And that's something that you can fix, with little experience. But to kind of bump into the spots where it's not working correctly, you do need to be more of a heavy user. So if that's the case, then you would file a bug report, and that's what I have up here. So in my case, I had been using pandas, and I had bumped into this bug several times, where I was trying to make a quick horizontal bar plot, and I wanted to label the x and the y-axis. And every time I put the x-axis label, it ended up on the y-axis, and I put the y-axis label, and it just went nowhere. And I had bumped into this on multiple versions, and eventually just got frustrated and went and saw if anyone had reported this. Now, Pandas, very, very popular library. Why wasn't this fixed? That was kind of my question, right? But plotting functionality is, I would say, a lesser-known functionality of Pandas, and so maybe it hadn't really been bumped into. Another possibility is that someone could have potentially put in the bug report, but it was deprioritized by the maintainers. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. You're bumping into a bug. Volunteering to fix it means you now control the priority of when that actually gets fixed, which is very nice. So when you're going to report a bug, first make sure that it hasn't already been reported. You don't want to be wasting the maintainer's time. So you should be checking the latest version and also the main branch of that repository, checking that it doesn't still exist. Also check the open and closed issues. So it's possible someone has already done it. They decided it was a feature, not a bug. And so, consider that. When you do put in that bug report, you want to make sure that you're detailed with what you're putting in there, and also you provide a reproducible example so that the maintainers can look at that and make an accurate decision of whether that should be fixed or not. Also, you can volunteer to fix it, right? You found a bug, you can go and fix it, and again, that's your way of prioritizing that it gets done right away. And also, if you don't know how to do it, but you want to fix it because it impacts you and it bothers you, right? You can ask them, I'd love to work on this, I'm not sure how to get started, can you give me some pointers? Okay, and the final strategy is to propose and implement a new feature. So now, again, you need to be even more of a heavy user. What are the pain points of using this software? Is there something that could be done in a better way? Is there a feature missing? So in my case, coming back to NumPy doc, once I had learned about pre-commit, I was surprised that there wasn't a pre-commit hook for NumPy doc. So it seemed to me that it would be much nicer, especially in the scikit-learn case, that every time you were adding code or something, it was checking, are you still following this docstring standard that you want to follow? So I had built that on my own, and then I approached the NumPy doc team by putting in a feature request, asking if they were interested. And they were, and then eventually that did lead to an invitation to become a core developer. So just like with the bug report, you want to make sure that it hasn't already been requested. So this is harder, right, because you might use very different words to describe something than someone else. So best effort, look through open and closed issues. And then when you're describing in your feature request, make sure that you're very detailed. Show examples of how you want it to work and what kind of effect it would have on your workflow. Again, you can volunteer to do that change. You're clearly vested in it, you're interested in it. But it's important that you go in, again, there is a possibility that they don't want that, right? It is a lot of work for the maintainers to then maintain foreign code that maybe they were new to. And it's also possible that it just doesn't fit with the roadmap. So be polite about it. And you can also, if you want to, you could fork, you can create your own project. That's totally fine. I've also linked to a very good talk from EuroPython that gives you more of an idea about the maintainer's perspective and why they might not want to make certain or accept certain feature requests like that. Okay, so those are the 5 strategies, and they were in order of the least experience to the most experience you would need to have with a given project. But there is no best strategy. You just tailor it to whatever you're comfortable with, because no contribution is too small. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about being successful when you actually make your contribution now. So I've said this a few times, I'll say it again. If there's an issue up there, always let the world know that you're working on it, comment on it and say that you're working on it, say if you need help. If the project has setup instructions for getting your dev environment up and ready, please follow those, right? That's going to help you actually be able to not get frustrated when you're working on it. But you might also run into problems where those setup directions don't work. And now you actually have your first PR right there, fixing it before you even get to the hard stuff. If you are new to development, then definitely try out documentation-based contributions, because that gets you comfortable with Git and GitHub without the extra overhead of the coding. And if you have the opportunity, if you're around tomorrow, definitely attend the sprints. And make sure that you're polite and patient in all of your interactions. This is public, and people will remember if you're not polite later on. And also remember that maintainers are doing this many times outside of their work, so be patient and allow them time to get to things. So once you've had that first contribution, then it's about keeping up the momentum. And I alluded to this before, but look for opportunities to share knowledge across projects. Maybe one project you're working on has this really neat GitHub action workflow that does something that another project would benefit from. Look out for those. That's a great way to get started, get your foot in the door. You can also help others contribute. So I'll talk about the case of the scikit-learn meta issue. So if you've already had a PR merged, or a couple PRs where you've had comments on, and you see someone else putting in a PR towards that same meta issue or towards something else, and the CI is failing, maybe you know why. You can comment on that issue and let them know, hey, I think you need to fix, this thing over here. Or you can say, oh, they've pointed out this particular thing to me in the past, you might want to address this. And all that kind of stuff, whether or not it's contributing code or just being active in that community, will definitely get you noticed by the maintainers. They will start recognizing your name, your GitHub handle. If you meet them at conferences, they will come up to you, and I've had that happen with several different projects. And that's really nice to meet people in person after all those interactions online. And that was also how, again, the NumPy core developer invitation came around. It was just caring about the project and contributing things, consistently. Okay, so I hope I inspired you to start your open source journey. If you do end up using any of these strategies or making your first contribution, I'd love to hear about it. I will celebrate with you on on social media. It doesn't have to be LinkedIn. Anything, and you can let me know. On the left, I have a QR code for feedback to let me know what you thought of this talk, and on the right, there are links to follow me. And I hope to see you at sprints tomorrow. Thank you.